With all the buzz and headlines and trend lines, you would think it's all podcasts and pure play streaming in car these days. But in fact, the numbers tell us that is still a long way from the truth. Here are all the new tricks radio's using to stay king of the road. Still, among younger drivers, or in younger model year cars, or at the junction of the two, there's still a significant growth rate, of course, around podcasts and pure play streaming. So SiriusXM finds itself in an interesting position. The former disruptor is now at risk of being disrupted. So their answer to that is something called SiriusXM 360L. It rolls in the satellite radio content like it always has, but also on-demand content, streams, and back catalog material, not just what's live on the satellite channels at a given moment. That's a new thing for SiriusXM. Some more tricks. If you go to the sports button over here, you can check out live sports. And also, if you go to the play-by-play screens, you can find your favorite teams, and when you're listening to a broadcast, you'll actually see graphics of the current play-by-play stats. Kind of like on one of those web streams. Under many stations, you can also go to a new feature here, this little bell called Notify. If it's applicable on that station, you can be notified of other content of that type as it airs on any of the stations or channels on satellite radio. That's a nice way to be scanning it all the time and not you having to be turning the knob all the time and saying, I wonder if it's playing over here. This will let you know. Steve Winwood. Down below Notify is a search icon. That initiates a voice search for just about anything. It could be a show name, it could be a team name, or it could be an artist name you want to listen to. And it'll pull up all your choices, whether they're a live satellite broadcast now or some kind of on-demand content. Of course, as with anything internet connected, you got to have recommendations, right? Everyone's in the recommendation game, and SiriusXM 360L does that as well. Somehow this bizarre list of content is recommended for me or whoever else has been driving this truck lately, but it's an interesting way of saying let's narrow down and winnow the huge width of satellite radio and try to make it a little more focused for you. And SiriusXM has partnered with Pandora to integrate creation of personalized streaming stations inside the 360L interface, based on the artist you see there. It'll be available to you if you subscribe to SiriusXM at their top pricing level, but the Pandora stations will at least be ad-free. Now the bad news, SiriusXM costs a lot of money. It's currently $11 to $21 on a monthly basis. In a world where Netflix is only $9 to $16 on a monthly basis. That's a little bit discordant to me, and I think maybe to you as well. As a result, we're going to show you a lot of low-cost or free versions of modernized in-dash radio. Now, the big overhaul that came to radio a number of years ago was HD radio. A lot of you may have this and have not explored it in your car, so let's cover this first. HD radio does a lot of things. That's part of why it's a little complicated. It maintains the analog stations you've already got, with all the noise they may have. It also creates a digital version of those same stations, AM or FM, that can sound a lot cleaner, although coverage may be spottier, depending where you live. And then thirdly, it adds a set of additional stations, HD1 and HD2, like you see right here. Those are entirely separate formats or additional channels from the same provider that usually have completely different content. So you've got a lot of things going with HD radio. I would argue HD radio has been somewhat confusing to a lot of consumers. And it came along at a time when many of them were not exactly hungry for more radio. They were starting to tilt over to new interactive forms of audio, so its timing wasn't great. About 60 million cars in the U.S. have HD radio. I don't think 60 million people who own those cars are using it actively, and that's out of about 250 million cars around the U.S., so it's a minority slice. That said, if you've got an HD radio setting in your car and you've never played with it, play with it. It's the first step to revolutionizing broadcast radio. Now let's go to our apps that roll up broadcast radio. Remember, we're not going into Pandora and Spotify and any pure play services. This is all about modernizing radio through the internet. And the king of those still has to be TuneIn, the largest aggregator of radio station streams. It has about 100,000 radio stations sharing their stream through it from all over the world, and millions of podcasts as well. It has numerous MLB and NHL games. And TuneIn is supported by a lot of car makers, many of them embedded into their in-dash stack. Then there's iHeart, the iHeartRadio app, which comes from the iHeartMedia company. They are the largest single group of stations in the U.S. They've also got the stations of a number of their frenemies. A number of other radio station conglomerates are in here as well. But it's still not nearly as encompassing and wide as TuneIn's array of stations, which dwarfs this. But TuneIn's also a global assortment on top of that. iHeart also has podcasts and other special content that is derived from their media company in particular. It's going to be more hit and miss about finding your favorite podcast. Many of the ones I listen to aren't in here. Some are. It's big, but it's not universal. Speaking of not universal, that brings us to the Radio.com app. Now, these stations used to all appear on TuneIn. They used to be the CBS radio stations. Now they're owned by a company called Entercom. And they decided to pull their stations off TuneIn and stick them on this app called Radio.com. So it's a very siloed garden, and it's a here or nowhere approach. That's pretty controversial, but if there are major stations in your area that are part of this group, this is how you listen to them as a stream. That said, it still covers 235 stations in 46 metro areas. And like everything else these days, it's also a podcast aggregator, but not as comprehensive as what you probably use as a podcast aggregator. Now let's turn away from all these different apps and go to what's happening in the radio industry itself, some things you may not have heard of. One of them that's kind of come and gone is Next Radio. You may wonder what happened to this. We've talked about it a couple times. This was from the MS Broadcasting Corporation, which owns stations primarily in Indianapolis and New York City. Don't ask. And they had this idea of pulling internet and radio together. Broadcast signal comes in, but it's augmented through an app using the FM radio chip in some but not all phones to give you an interactive experience with album art, some metadata, some basic interactivity, but mostly a broadcast coming into your phone. They basically have shelved it, and if you're looking for the latest on it, don't look. Instead, take a look at something called hybrid radio. This is a global standards organization trying to get the content creators, the broadcasters, and the radio makers, especially in cars, to be on the same level of broadcast, plus internet connection, plus lots of rich data and interactivity. For things like visuals of album art or weather, metadata so a broadcast can be tagged, categorized, and treated as a data object, and interactivity through either a radio or an app. You could press a button to tag or bookmark things. All of this is meant to please car makers and consumers who've been getting a rich, consistent presentation on the streaming platforms and then find it's much more of a hodgepodge of quality and format on broadcast platforms. While hybrid radio is said to be offered on around 80% of radio content in the EU, it's basically unheard of in the US. The U.S. National Association of Broadcasters and Audi are doing early U.S. trials. DTS Connected Radio is another hybrid of FM broadcast and wireless internet data. It's from Xperi, which is the same company that owns the technology behind HD Radio. It also offers a radio experience that has rich metadata for visuals and interactivity, as well as rich visual and audio emergency alerts that are currently only found on HD Radio. The folks behind DTS Connected Radio promise the first car with the technology will be in showrooms in 2020, though they're not saying what car that will be. Now, this all suggests that perhaps hybrid radio, DTS Connected Radio, car makers and broadcasters are about to get together and have a breakthrough in modernizing broadcast radio, maybe in 2020 or soon thereafter. But I've heard this before, with the promise of AM stereo, RDS, and HD radio, all of which delivered less than a revolution. So I'm not going to hold my breath, but I am hopeful.